Hello Proponomics people, and I just wanted to use today's video to chat through what's happened with inflation in the US in the most recent 24 hours, and then what the implications have been for the UK, and then what the implications maybe should be for the UK and where we're at the moment. So for a brief recap, I've been banging on about inflation since February 2021 as an inevitable consequence of all the money that had gone into the system. At the time, the bond yields had actually gone negative in the UK, and the Bank of England were sending out some communications regarding whether we should consider negative interest rates in the UK. Now, they've actually been used fairly extensively now in developed economies, even before the pandemic. So there was plenty of precedent for what a negative interest rate might do, how it would impact things. It might surprise you to hear that people still buy bonds when there are negative interest rates, but ultimately they're looking for something that's 100% safe, that pays a coupon to pay their future obligations. So there was still appetite for bonds, just simply for the government holding on to the money and being the one true source that someone could trust for 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 50, 100 years even, because there were some 100-year COVID bonds that were issued. But there we go. So inflation was first of all marked as transitory around the world, and everyone was saying it'll pass, it's just shooting up because this price has shot up of oil or copper or gold or things that were mined. Energy was a big factor way before Russia and Ukraine. A year before Russia and Ukraine, energy prices started to move upwards. We know there was a massive disruption in all the supply chains because in months like May 2020, when the oil price actually went negative for West Texas Intermediate, so you could buy oil and get paid to take delivery of it at spot price at one point. If you had a ranch in Texas or similar, you'd have been laughing, I'd have thought, if people took advantage of that sort of thing, if they were able to. Not outside of the possibilities of most of us, but that's where we were at that point in time. Decisions that were made at that point in time by energy companies, by commodity manufacturers, by miners, by all these sorts of companies were basically, the world's going to hell in a handcart, everything's going to be locked down forever and ever, be careful, we don't want to be producing a lot next year. And instead that didn't happen at all, because the effect of the massive government economic stimulus from governments around the world, certainly from the US, where they really fired the gun in a big way, and to a lesser extent in the UK, was always going to force through some inflation. So to put those things into context, normally historically the UK has run at nearly 1% higher inflation as a rule than the US, and all the headlines are currently saying don't bet on the US to drop rates before the UK, because the US had this inflation print yesterday which was 0.1% ahead of consensus ultimately, and their core inflation is a bit more under control at 3.7, whereas our last print was still 4.5. So I'm not sure we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater too much. There is concern over gasoline prices and that being an issue, particularly because that means also there's geopolitical tension in the Middle East that everyone will know about. Of course, that could escalate. If it does, the price of oil could shoot right up. And in fact, in recent weeks, as there's been looking like there's more and more tension, the price has come back over $90 a barrel. If you apply my rule of thumb inflation of about 25% to everything that's happened since 2020, today's $90 a barrel is actually more like about 71, 72 before the pandemic, which is still expensive. And we had some very cheap oil if we go back sort of 9 or 10 years or so, but it's not particularly crippling oil price per barrel. But of course, it's where it could go that's the concern. So should also say the US has got its rates a little bit above where we are at the moment. They're at 5.25 to 5.5. So that's the range in which their 3-month T-bill tends to trade within. So say 5.37 to split the difference. That's roughly where they're at the moment, and it's affected their 10-year yields upwards. And those 10-year yields have been being affected for the last week or two anyway, as they've climbed right back up. So they're well over 4% on their 10-year yield. We're not, but they also have strength in their economy that the UK doesn't necessarily have. So we do need to bear that in mind. What annoys me more than anything is that people are now finally getting hold of the fact that this is ultimately not just transitory, and also it was never a debate about whether it was transitory or secular. The only sensible debate there ever should have been on the inflation issue should be how much transitory inflation will there be and how long will that take to work through the system? How much secular inflation will there be on the back of a pandemic? And potentially, how much secular inflation will the transitory inflation leave behind? So there's really three factors that should have gone into that conversation, but they didn't. And I still, to this day, I don't know why. I don't know whether that's deemed to be too complex to be particularly newsworthy. Economics news is often derided as economics entertainment rather than economics news, but I think it would have been better off not to insult everybody's intelligence and just have that clue from the start, because it's the one thing that I really disagree with some of the most preeminent economists in the world about, and it feels a bit strange to be sitting here doing that nearly on my own, not quite on my own. There have been other people who've talked about it on podcasts and all the rest of it. Generally speaking, I'm talking from an American perspective. I haven't heard too many UK perspectives on this. One of the UK perspectives I heard recently, that was inflation was on its way down and back under control, and that was from Gary Stevenson, who is the author of, I think it's called The Trading Game, his book, particularly left-wing economic campaigner, although he was a city trader, hence the name of his book. Gary's got some really interesting ideas. He's a very, very bright individual. I don't agree with some of the stuff he says about the root causes of where the problems are in today's society and what's going on with all of that, and the fact that the rich are buying all the houses and all the rest of some of the stuff he goes on about, because the evidence is that they're not. Ultimately, second home ownership is going downwards, not upwards. Landlording is becoming more of the preserve of a limited company. That's all George Osborne's work in 2015. I'm not sure Gary understands the property sector in enough detail to know what's been driving this direction of travel, but precisely zero people are surprised after the tax changes in 2015 that single-let landlords would dispose and wealthier, bigger companies would try and take over, and that's the direction of travel that Cameron and Osborne wanted in a lot of the stuff that they did. And we'll be living with that legacy unless Section 24 is repealed. But given that the Conservatives haven't done it, I can't see Labour doing it in reality, because it would take Labour to realise that they want and need a functional relationship with the PRS. And I can't see them offering big tax breaks to the general population. And also, compliance attitudes have changed massively on rentals, even though there's still a ton of rentals out there that aren't compliant, that aren't good standard, that aren't all the rest of it. A lot of old school 1970s style arrangements are still out there. But anyway, inflation. So, as I say, US core printed 3.7, still compares favourably to UK core. I've said a number of times they're 6 to 12 months ahead of us in their economic cycle. They had their recession, which was a technical recession back in 2022, compared to ours at the end of 2023. So that suggests they're sort of 12 to 15 months behind us in the cycle. But they had this kind of resurgence. And for those who remember back to the days of 2011, 2012, we'd had the great financial crisis, we'd had the stimulus packages. In the US, you'd had TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Programme. We had funding for lending. We had all sorts of bank bailouts. We had public ownership of banks. We had all sorts of things going on. But what we had at that point was a little bit of inflation. There was, I think, Feb 2011 when we were up at 5.2, even though interest rates were super on the floor. I don't remember any chatter at the time about putting rates back up on the back of that. We just had to suck it up a bit. And actually, inflation was not seen as a bad thing, because guess what? Government debt had gone up, as it has done again. And like I've said many times before, I really don't believe there's a government that are uncomfortable with a 4% inflation rate. It's very risky. It's not a great strategy. It should unnerve things like bond markets, and indeed it would, because that's going to eat away at the capital of the bondholders, and that's going to be a concern for them. But I don't believe a government's unhappy with 4% inflation when they've had a massive amount of increased debt, as they have done, A, after 2008, and B, after 2020 and 2021. So 2011-12, we were talking about wobbles. We were talking about a double dip recession that was supposedly going to happen. That didn't quite emerge. We had some flatness, and then the stimulus eventually worked its way around the economy, did its work. We all know now that a lot of that quantitative easing stimulus went into inflate asset prices. A lot of that money didn't necessarily go to where it was wanted to. Was that more the fault of the austerity policies and the way that they were implemented? You can have a long and pretty good debate about that, actually. Probably not with George Osborne, because I'm still not convinced that he understands economics in the first place. But you could certainly go into the pros and cons of that and have a very good ding-dong about that if you so see fit. So where's inflation going to go in the UK, and what's that going to mean? I'm personally still a believer. We've got a dropping CPI at the moment because, as I've said, energy prices have come down and down in terms of the price cap. However, with the oil price going back up, how will that impact things? And with disturbances in the Red Sea, how does that impact things? We've now got a very different looking energy importing situation. We've still got fragility. We rely a lot on the Gulf states these days as a general rule, and we're also relying on LNG, liquid natural gas, from the United States these days. All of these things that popped up after we realised really we shouldn't be trusting Russia too much anymore to supply any of this stuff. Now, the UK wasn't a big relier on Russia, but they're still second order dependent on them because Russia produces 8 million barrels of oil a day apart from anything else, and there's a huge amount of the world's wheat that comes out of Ukraine and gigantic amounts of natural gas. You've surely heard the name Gazprom a couple of times, if not more. So that's where we are at the moment. Where are we going to get to? Well, stronger for longer is the message that comes out the back of all of this. We don't want to overreact to a 0.1% overshoot in core inflation, but it does prove my point that I've been going on about, that the US got to 3% CPI in June last year, and we're now in April 2024. We've had March's figures yesterday, and ultimately we're still not under 3. In fact, we're back over 3.5. So there is this sticky level of inflation that's in there, and it's the first time really I've read one of Paul Donovan, the UBS chief economist, pieces this morning, and he was very, very keen to point out how much inflation is coming down strongly in the US in lots of places. He says there's deflation in almost every consumer price subcategory, collapsing clothing prices in Tampa. I mean, these sort of anecdotal examples, I'm not sure how helpful they are. Ultimately, core inflation takes out the volatility and tells us where we are, and it's struggling. Now, Paul's been a big fan of pointing out profit-led inflation and how companies have been effectively gouging prices. I'm not sure that that's a great argument at the moment, especially when you look at something like California, which is ultimately just raised minimum wage to $20 an hour. And when it did so, I think there were 7 large fast food chains with 20 employees or more who announced they were closing in California when that legislation actually came through. So the point is, the business model doesn't stack up. They can't just pass it on to the consumers. That's not profit-led inflation. Ultimately, if profits are 25% higher than they were 4 years ago, that's because inflation has devalued everything by 25%. And I haven't seen a lot of evidence that profits have ballooned beyond that 25%. Of course, if you look at the companies that have done really well, they have done, but that's just survivorship bias. I'm talking about the overall position of the S&P 500, which again, you would expect to be 25% higher nominally, because we get obsessed with these nominal indices and we go on about these, oh, it's a record price for this, it's a record price for that. Of course it is. Inflation has been around 25% almost across the board, right? So expect record prices. It doesn't matter. This is why you need to look at things in real terms, not in nominal terms. But the world has got so used to, I can't believe the number of things that I listen to that are talking about rising prices. There's a pretty good piece from the Resolution Foundation on YouTube, if anybody wants to go and check it out, that was released a few days ago about rising rents, for example. But not once in that debate they had, and they had some very good people in that debate. Richard Donald from Zoopla, I'm a big fan of, but not one person mentioned inflation driving them forward. And I just can't understand for the life of me how you can have that conversation without talking about inflation. And I would recommend you go and watch that debate, because there's some really interesting figures, including the way that rent has been trending downwards over time since the year 2000. So I'm going to be going into that in a bit more detail on Sunday. I'm going to leave it there for the moment, but what's the moral of the story? Rates are stronger for longer. We're going to have to get used to that and get on with it, and that's why our bond yields are back over 4% as we crack on throughout today. Thank you.